Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Takeup. Had a couple technical issues, but let's go ahead and announce this for everybody what's going on today. Apparently, even after a year, you can have some trouble getting things together. Here's the first thing I'll let you know. Today, this is what we're doing. Good afternoon. It is episode 52, Q&A part 2, outlining continued, defining shape, and 1 year of the Takeup. So there's our intro. Sometimes you just have to roll with the punches, folks. We've had a long day. I have been on 2 shows already so far, so it's been quite a busy day for me over here in my home studios. But like I said, love to be in the Embroidery studios. Pretty soon, I think you're going to see me be able to find a way to get back to the lovely Embroidery studios so that we can have a little more fun and maybe see some new samples and things like that. But for now, let's go ahead and celebrate this year of being together, reciprocators. So it's great to have you guys on here. We're definitely going to go back and tackle some things that we didn't get to finish last time. We didn't get to talk about outlining in borders the way we did previously. We didn't get to finish that discussion. Got some new stuff to add to that. And we're going to talk a little bit about shape building. Going to be a bit of a looser episode today. I'd like to talk also a little bit about the Takeup itself, where it has gone, where I see it going, and the kind of things that I'd like to see us all kind of do as we continue. I really see this as the end of season 1, if you put it that way, and coming into season 2 the next year of the Takeup, because this is going to continue. Next week, I hope to have some special stuff going on. So I think I'll do some more to celebrate next week. I know certainly it's been a very busy week for me, but I want everybody to get in on this. So reciprocators, show up next week. Will be the beginning of season 2 for the Takeup. Something new and sometimes something old. I found that something I'm having to deal with myself lately is that when I talk to people about what they want to see from me, from the Takeup, some of the topics are things that I've already covered. And I hope you guys are okay with that. I want to go in depth and talk about different sorts of aspects of things. I know one big one, very likely to be the subject next week, is dealing with fonts, digitizing fonts and lettering. I know that I've covered it before, but I think we can go deeper. We can talk about small text. We can talk about breaking fonts up. We can talk about working from different kinds of source material. And I think it can be interesting. I know a lot of people really like the typography episodes. We're definitely going to go back to patches again. Cannot at all get rid of that one. That's one where I'll be teaching some actual courses on it. And we'll probably talk about that again here. And we have tons of stuff about texture, digitizing, and also, honestly, we will be dealing with some stuff that's business and stuff that's motivations and stuff that's creativity, not just embroidery, though always the crux, the main focus of this show will be embroidery. Definitely you're going to see e-commerce. Definitely you're going to see creativity, art, design, things that I think enrich your life as an embroiderer as well. But without anything else getting in the way, let me stop and talk to everybody. I love to have you guys in here. I'm super excited you guys get to be here for this kind of official 1 year of content that we managed to get done. So let me just jump in and talk to everybody here first. Cindy King, good afternoon, Cindy. Happy to have you here. And if you haven't noticed, I will go ahead and point this out as I do at the beginning of each show, that I have a link in the links already in the discussion, whether you're on Facebook, on YouTube, and you can go ahead and grab that here. We do have mostly the same materials from last week. We've got a couple new materials. We're going to talk about negative space and stuff like that, where we discuss how we build shapes. We're going to discuss a little bit about that. Mostly just going to talk about it, but we do have a couple articles there that are interesting to you, especially the stuff about digitizing and what have you. And I'll go ahead and show you this. The stuff about distortion, the stuff about dimensional digitizing. These things are very helpful when we're building things. And then definitely a little bit about stitch types. Like I said, stuff we've talked about before, but we're going to come at it from some different angles. And like I said, we're going to do some deep dives, some example work. And one of the things people have asked for over and over as we go into the next year is for me to actually show you a piece of art and discuss how I interpreted it and why. So we're definitely going to do what I'm going to consider some breakdowns. Some design breakdowns are coming. Definitely also some things that are classes of designs. We've done some of this before. I know we did a little bit of work on badges in detail, but that's something I got asked again and again and again. So we'll probably do another run through police and military and official badges, because they have very similar things, but like civic seals are also very similar, that kind of stuff. So whatever you guys want to see, come talk to me about it. Hit me up in the comments. Tell me what kind of topics do you want to see. Embroidery, also apparel business, certainly multimedia, anything that's in our bailiwick, in our wheelhouse here together. So design, creativity, but definitely embroidery and digitizing foremost. Come to me with these topics and we'll see what we can get done, because I want to do the show you need. If I'm doing my job, I'm doing the show you need. But links are here. You're going to see that there's the stuff that was there from last week, but then we're going to have a couple great things from about negative space. and some examples of negative space, because we're going to talk about that in the context of how we do outlining. There's a certain kind of outlining that deals a lot with negative space. And the last little link on here is something fun. So I'll go ahead and drop this out. If you didn't see this morning, after much cajoling from our own Aaron Montgomery, one of the hosts of the Two Regular Guys that I'm the producer on, I did a short show with him that we called The Half. We are both extraordinary talkers who continue to go on forever. So we decided, let's do the thing that we usually do. We usually talk amongst ourselves right after the Two Regular Guys show. Instead, we went live with it, and we did a half hour that we cut off at the end of the half hour, no matter what. And it was actually shorter than our usual conversations are privately. But we did that this morning. It was something fun. So if you want to just see Aaron and I kind of get loose and just talk about whatever, unscripted, no topics, just what we want to discuss, go ahead and check that out at that last link as well. So with that, let's talk about some more people who are here today. Jeff Fuller of Embroidery Nerd. Fuller's doing great stuff. I saw you guys digitizing live yesterday with, of course, Justin Armenta. Happy Friday to all the reciprocators. Absolutely. Happy to have you guys in here. Christine Shreve, who's been doing great work. Saw her interview Lisa Shaw, one of my other favorite people in this embroidery world. Good afternoon, Eric. Congratulations on the year of the Takeup. That's an accomplishment. I hope so. I think it's nice that I've managed to put a whole year of this together during some difficult times. I will say I have not had even quality over every episode, but I do like to think that I bring something every week that is valuable, even if it's just listening to me talk for a while when you have nothing to put in your headphones. Brian Bailey, creator of Brilliance and brilliant man altogether. Woohoo, 1 year. Thank you, sir. And by the way, thank you for the time and space to make this happen. Honestly, he's helped me a great deal of resources and aid, and helped with the impetus for me to get this done. I was kind of hemming and hawing over I was going to do a live show, and Brian said, get it done. And Lisa chimed in and just said, go ahead and do it. And Brian's help has been invaluable in this. So thank you, Brian. Cindy King, happy anniversary. Cindy, thank you for being here so much. Marta Caffrey, congratulations on 1 year. Thank you. I'll take that. Daryl says, happy anniversary, Eric. Congratulations. Thank you, Daryl. Always putting out great stuff out there in California. And Daryl, super positive guy, super awesome guy. If you haven't seen his streams, go check out the stuff that he's doing with his shop. Joe Rita, hello from freezing Austin, cold Texas. Austin, Texas, in the cold. Well, I will say last time I was in Austin, it was hot and humid. I'll take freezing rather than hot humidity. Desert people don't do well. Frank, over in the UK, good evening all and happy anniversary. And yes, a drink would be in order. I don't have one, but have one for me, sir. It's still a little early for me. 2:40 is a little early. Marianne coming in from Santa Fe, New Mexico, lovely place. As you guys know, I'm in Albuquerque, but Santa Fe is a frequent visit. Can't wait for everything to kind of simmer down in the world so I can get up to Santa Fe again. Justin Armenta says, I hope season 2 is as good as season 1. I don't know, man. They probably need to replace the main star. He's getting a little tired. But let's hope for season 2. Like I said, I would like to do a season. I'm thinking of it in that way so that I can take on some new stuff. And if I come back to some topics that people are begging me to take on that were in season 1, I'm going to go back and see what can I add, what can I make better. So like I said, it would be awesome to have more input from you guys. Any input you want to give about what you want to see. Had some great input. And like I said, I'll call people out. If you have given me a topic and I'm going to work on your topic, when I put that on there, if you don't mind, I will say thank you and name you, and heck, name your business and your links if you want. Carolyn says cliffhanger today. Apparently she might have seen what happened earlier. Like I said, on the half this morning with Aaron, we really did. We have a buzzer, and at 30 minutes we cut off. It's not going to happen here. Bonus time is a feature of this show. We'll see. We'll see how much I get covered today. Beth says, congratulations on 1 year. I really enjoy watching Takeup. Thank you, Beth. Thank you for the congratulations, and thank you for being here. If you guys aren't here, I'm not doing this. So this is the point. This is here for you, and it is here because of you. You guys are the air in the lungs of this beast. It doesn't work without you being here. Without somebody watching, there's no point. So I'd love to have you guys here. Greg, good afternoon from Boston. Happy anniversary. Thank you for being here. Tom of Buzzards Bay Embroidery and doing his own thing in consulting and teaching. Tom, great to have you here. Aaron, hello. Happy to have you here as well. Just hi all. 1 year. Wow, congrats. Thank you, sir. And by the way, some of you guys have sent me some messages yesterday included that I haven't gotten to answer. Super busy week. I will catch up in the next day or so with some of those messages people have said. And by the way, that's my mom, guys. Kay. Hi, Mom. Thank you for watching. Woohoo. 1 year is a big deal. I know. And thank you, Mom. If you want to know how I know anything about thread and such, worked with my mom, too. She was a seamstress, among many other things, but an artistic person and a creative person who has helped me through everything. So thank you, Mom. And Fanny says, hi from Belgium. Happy belated Belgian beer for the anniversary. I will take it. Sue Shapiro says, just lurking as a kind of a newbie from Cold Winter Chicago. You know, Sue, it is okay to be a newbie here. I will get technical. I'll talk about a lot of technical stuff, but if you go back through the materials, you'll find that I do all kinds of newbie stuff. Some of my best stuff is over at MrXStitch.com. You'll actually find a couple of those pieces that are in that links list or about distortion, pull and push distortion. And that's stuff that, you know, is really clear for newbies. Sorry, guys, I'm like adjusting my hat here. I'm having camera and hat issues, but my light is kind of killing me today. Bad eyes and migraine time yesterday, so kind of the ring light that everybody loves is killing me. But Sue, happy to have you in here. And honestly, newbies are welcome and newbie questions are welcome. Everybody can get something from that beginner's mindset. If you come with a question that somebody has already answered, you never know when somebody either in the comments or myself has something new that you haven't heard yet. So happy to have that there. Ramona said, almost missed y'all. Happy to have you here, Ramona, as well. And then Brian says, I think we're in for deep dive sessions occasionally. Absolutely. We're going to do some deep dives. I think that small lettering and lettering in general is going to have more than one, right? Those are really going to happen. We're going to have to talk about that because the more and more I see it, people are digitizing fonts and everybody always digitizes lettering. Lettering is a key portion of embroidery. It always has been. Embroidery by itself has been used in personalization more than anything. The classic embroidery everyone knows, if they don't know anything else, is the name over the shirt pocket, the mechanic's shirt, old school with the patch with the name on it, the name on the hat. These personalizations that were around forever, even before the detailed stuff that we do was around, that stuff is critical, and lettering is critical and absolutely is part of all embroidery, all digitizing. So that's something we're definitely going to do, but we're going to get into many things. Plus there's going to be I have some other equipment, some other things we're going to talk about and share, and we're going to do some testing. So like I said, testing and showing and dealing with the same stuff. So yes, still lecture style. It's the way I work, but we're going to go into more detail on some topics. And honestly, if it warrants doing a topic entirely over again, I'm not expecting that I will always do stuff forever. In fact, what I'm going to say is, yes, we do new work frequently. Yes, I try and bring in more things that I've learned. Yes, new technologies arise, but there is a certain cycle to the publication and the education industry where I know every 3 years I'm going to teach 3D foam. I know every 3 years I'm going to do a small lettering class. I know every 3 years I'm going to do an article about workwear and how to design for durability. These things come up over and over again because these issues don't leave and new people come into the industry. And there's nothing wrong with that. But hopefully we will always bring something new to it. And that's why I love you guys being here, so that you can bring yourself to it, bring your experience to it. There's things you know I may not know, and I'd love for you to share. So Ramona says, hi, Mom. So there you go, Mom. Now you have fans too. Charles says, hi from Wales. Happy to see you in Charles. Awesome to have people from all over the place, all over the world. And Donna says, hello from Orks Island, Washington. Keep it up. Eric, learned so much from you. Thank you very much. All right. So I've said hi to everybody. I know it took a little longer today, but it's something that I really want to do, especially with this year. Like I said, this thing doesn't happen without you guys. And that's why we have a name for everybody. And, proudly, I call you guys reciprocators, because I think we are people who give back. We reciprocate. Yes, it's a part in your machine that makes the needles go up and down, but you know who really makes the needles go up and down? We do. I do. You do. We make the things that work. We sell. We help our customers. We create. We make the needles go up and down. We're the reciprocators, but we're also people who reciprocate. When we're given something good, we give back. And I'm proud to be with people like you guys here. So thank you for being here for the Takeup. And honestly, I cannot be happier with the group of people that we have here. You guys are engaged, helpful, respectful, awesome people who are here to get better, who care. And you know what? It means a lot. So thank you. Thank you for being here. Let's go ahead and start into the actual topic. I mean, we do have a topic today. I could just talk about how great you guys are, and I could just talk about how great it is to do what I do. But I think that there's other things we can talk about. Last time, I'll just go ahead and show you this one more time. If you guys haven't gotten the links, it's in the comments. But if you want to look up some of the articles that I have discussed, will discuss, and if you just want some supplementary materials, there's some good stuff in there that might help you. Like I said, the dimensional digitizing thing, though it's an older version of things I've since taught in a more detailed version, there are some great comments in here that may lead you to more, to understanding more, a little bit about distortion, a little bit about creative textures and breaking up shapes, which we'll be discussing today as well. But primarily, We're going to talk about borders again. Now, I know everybody's saying, well, you talked about borders last week. You talked about how things get together, how you want to border, how you want to outline, how we build things together. And I'll say, yes, we talked about it. But part of what we talked about was just essentially running through designs, and I just ran through and said, okay, this is how these are going. And unbeknownst to me, I had selected designs because of the questions people asked me that were only of a certain type. In general, I was selecting designs that had a border of a satin stitch border that was run underneath satin stitch lettering on top, so that what we essentially had was a border that the satin stitch bar was on top of, and we were revealing the edge of the border, and it was underneath that top, very much like you would do with a 3D foam design. Why do we do that? Multiple reasons why you do that. Certainly, if you want texture, so you want your lettering to look like it's sitting on top of that border, that is a thing. You can do it for artistic means. The other reasons you do that, especially if you have some nice thin borders and you want to make sure that they're going to reveal and look nice and smooth. Sometimes you want to just reveal a little edge instead of having to have a very thin satin stitch border. You want a nice meaty border, and you also want a lot of overlap so that if things shift slightly when you're working, having a lot of overlap means that you can have a little bit of slop. You don't want the borders to be uneven from side to side, but if there's a little bit of shifting, having a 1 millimeter border versus, let's say, a 3 mil border that you're revealing, 1.5 mil on the outside edge, you might be able to get away with a little bit of it without having coverage problems or having things pull apart from each other, having gapping, things like that. So there's a couple of reasons why you might want to do that. And the thing is, truthfully, when I'm doing borders, I don't think of it as types. We can talk about types. We can say, okay, what kind of bordering do we have? We have the layering border, like I showed you last week, where we run a satin stitch outline underneath the edge of text that's going to run later. We run it back to front. That's one type of border we can do, and that's super common. Like I said, 3D foam, especially, you're going to do that because you're running flat borders and then 3D lettering on top of it. That's the classic example. Other than that, like I said previously, it's so that you can have that nice overlap, especially when you're on some unstable materials, some shifting caps, stuff like that. That's one of the things you might want to do. One of the other types of borders, obviously, is a full circle satin stitch border. Let's say we have a filled letter. It is uncomplicated, not connected to anything else. We're just going to run a border exactly on the edge of the shape of the letter, especially when it's a solid fill inside. But you can certainly draw your own around multiple segments of satin stitch. One of the things I talk about in this show over and over through this entire year is this. Just because you see a single solid shape and one flat color in your artwork doesn't mean you need to, and definitely doesn't mean you have to or should make that one single object in embroidery. This is just the truth. You can break these things up. So fairly frequently, you are going to break up lettering into satin stitch objects, small to medium-sized lettering, anything where the strokes in the letter, like the spine of the letter, these strokes that make up the letter, is going to often be satin stitch if those strokes are under 10 mils. You don't have to, and I'm going to show you pieces that are not done that way. But they're often done that way, and you may still want to put a border on top of that instead of behind it. Honestly, if you don't have any complicated shapes, if the borders don't run together, if the letters don't run together so tightly that there's no space in between them, then you're probably just going to border each letter, and you may decide to overlap them slightly. Even if the borders overlap slightly, you may not elect to cut out any sections or merge sections between the borders. There's entirely possibilities that you would go ahead and run full with satins. As we talked about yesterday when we talked about density, or last week when we talked about density, 2 satin stitch segments on top of each other, as long as the penetration points don't line up and kludge up too much, are not going to be too dense for almost anything. So you can certainly run a full satin border around a shape and then have them right on top of each other, and the 2 satin borders will not interfere too much. You can usually do that, especially if you're not running super high densities. So you may do full circle borders around each letter, around each object, and you may layer them out. And it doesn't mean that you do them on each thing unless you're dealing with super shifty, really unstable materials. You may do full borders. The other thing you can do is border on top, but you do things where you fill in negative space, where instead of doing full width borders, you have letters that are not entirely separated. These are letters that don't entirely separate from each other, so you can't really run a full width border around them. You have to actually do something specific to avoid that. And I can show you a couple of these, and let's see if we can get something on screen to show you, because I think that's where partially what we're talking about. Let's go ahead and jump this up. We're in software. Here's the same kind of thing I'm talking about. These are not satins. This is a fill that has the borders on top of it. And I can go ahead and kind of drop this out so you can see it. But this is what I'm talking about. The letters do touch, they run together, but they don't really have room for a full width border that's exactly the width of this piece. As you can see, if we did full width border all the way down to here, it would cut off a piece of this A, and so this actually doesn't go full width. That's another kind of border we can have where we fill in some portion of what I'm going to say the negative space is. The thing to remember when we're talking about negative space, I'm going to discuss this more, is that we're defining the letter not by the shapes we make in the letter itself. We're defining the letter by shapes we surround it with. Might sound a little complicated, but this is what we're doing. This is negative space. That's what I'm talking about when I discuss that. And I'm going to go into negative space a little bit more because people use it creatively for all kinds of other reasons. But this is what we're talking about with bordering. It's where we're filling in areas that are not letter. We're defining the letter by the things that are not letters. And that's really how that works. So it's it's something that you really have to style a little bit more, and you can make decisions about how it works. In this particular piece, you can see, and I'm going to go ahead and grab pointer focus. It's a tool that I use so you can actually see my pointer. Hopefully we can get that working. There we go. So pointer focus running again. Let's go ahead and show you what I'm talking about. We can see here that in some cases we're overlapping, right? In some places we're going to overlap. Here I want some texture. I want to see the difference between this A and this H. I'm going to go ahead and overlap and cut these together. This border is only going to go out to a certain point. It's not showing very well without being 3D, but let's go ahead and just show it to you again. Whereas this border that goes between the M and the N, it is so narrow that it doesn't make sense to have two full borders around both pieces or to have two strokes, and the texture isn't going to make much of a difference. Same thing here. The M doesn't have a separate border from the angled section into the straight section. I just have one big piece of satin here. But as you can see, this is what I'm talking about in the case of the order. Previously, we were discussing borders, and I was showing you guys stuff where I'm running the letters first, or the letters after on top of the border. This is where the border is being run after the lettering. And in this case, we're actually using a slab of fill that we're then cutting the negative space away from the letters. So this is a different kind of border that you're going to see frequently, especially with sports, mascot work. And the funny thing is, most people do this intuitively. If you were doing an image, something that wasn't a letter, frequently people will use negative space. They will border something, cut details into it, and have a filled area. If you had an animal head, you would have no problem deciding that you want to fill the animal head, and because of the way the mascot was set up, you're going to then, on top of it, cut out the mouth or cut out around the animal head using your satin stitch border. For some reason, an abstract shape, it doesn't bother people. When you go into lettering, they have a tendency to want to use a font, to want to use the keyboard font in this case, which really doesn't make sense for this particular piece. They have a tendency to want to use the whole letter and draw the object as the letter rather than building the overall design out of the objects they need. So in this particular case, there also is a technique here that I often use, which is to put, when I've got two borders on something and I have an outer revealed border and then I have another border, rather than running one border and then running another satin stitch around this entire thing, I will often run the outermost border and then the middle border and cover the gap between the two. So I'm going to go ahead and also play this out. I think that it's a worthwhile thing to just take a look at what I mean here. Certainly here's there's your hockey puck. You don't really need to see that, but here's the fill. That's the fill. Because we're only putting one layer of satin stitch on top of most of this, some areas, 2 layers of light satin stitch, I'm not too concerned about this being a full width fill. You could cut some sections out, but as we talked about last week, you will have traveling stitches, you will have other issues where you're making more stitches, you're making more travel, you're making more penetration points. It's driving wedges of thread into your material, and the more penetration points you have, like if you use too short of stitches in here too, you're going to have more cupping, dishing, three-dimensional rippling and distortion of the garment because we're driving those little wedges. But let's go ahead and see this. First, we have the black border, which is the outer border running. So here's the outer border. It's going to go into some negative spaces where it will be revealed in the gold border. The gold border will reveal some little chunks, some little inset pieces. I'm going to go ahead and throw satin stitches down there to fill those. So there we are. We have now our outer border done. We're going to go ahead and run the outer satin, and it's nice and wide, has lots of room for overlap. Now I'm going to run the inner negative spaces, and I'm going to run the middle border, the border that is on top, the border that covers the gap between the red and the black. And what I'm going to say is I actually have a lot of overlap here between the red and the black. Often I would back this up and have a little less overlap so that I don't always have 3 layers. But in this particular piece, ran really well in sport shirts, lightweight stuff. It was fine. So take for that what you will. And you're going to see that I'm using manual traveling stitches. This is a satin stitch. I did not cut a hole out of anything. I did not break up a piece of true type font. I did not use the letter vector in itself. I drew the shapes I needed. I laid down the image and drew the shapes I needed on top. Can you break pieces out of a font? You can. In this particular case, where is the font? I mean, the font's not really here. The font is here to help me see what shapes I need. When we're doing negative space, I can't rely on the font to do that for me. Certainly, I could use a bunch of graphical operators to smash the font flat or use different bars and breaks and cuts. I could use Pathfinder and Illustrator to break pieces apart. We could use vector software to do that. In this particular case, we don't want to do that. All we need that art for is to show us where we're going to draw our little elements, where we're going to draw our chunks of satin stitch. So here we are drawing our satin stitch on top of this full fill. We have the negative space in the A, and then you'll see I'm traveling to do more of the negative spaces because I'm eventually going to border the entire thing. So I'm traveling through, and you're also going to see that these little extra points that are sticking out on the A right here, you can see these here. These actually help me to make a really sharp point in the final piece as well to kind of support that stuff. So here's my negative space again. You're going to see there's the inside of the bottom of the N. There's the gap between the N and the M. Inside of the M again, out here. And then we're going to start running individual discrete sections of our satin stitch. And you can see I'm not just bordering all the way around using automatic bordering or automatic cornering. I'm stopping and I'm making my own tapers and caps and mitered joints when we come to corners. So that way you see how I have a full width cap there instead of using those two strokes. The two strokes were too tiny on top of each other, got too dense down into that thin area that I'm trying to define. So I break those apart. As you can see, I'm drawing multiple objects. Just because there is one slab of color, one object of any kind in your embroidery doesn't mean it should be made up of one embroidered object, one big fill. Usually it shouldn't. And same case here. I'm building this out of individual blocks. Here you can see that I don't go for a real cap. I just go ahead and trail that right up into that corner. No big problem here. Here's another cap. And you can see as I build all the way around, same thing as we go through. And of course, then we have the last little swoosh detail, because this is a really old logo when everything had swooshes on it. If you guys don't remember that era of graphic design, you're lucky. It's not something that was really pretty. So this is a very simple example of this stuff, right? Simple example. You can see that I'm using negative space, but not in any way that's particularly challenging. It is, however, an interesting way to handle it. You don't have to necessarily draw the letter out. I don't think this is overly dense. It wasn't overly dense to run. Certainly, I look back on it now and think I probably could have lightened some of it up. I could have removed some of the overlaps. I could have reduced some of the underlay. But it still stands to reason that we don't always need to go for this same type of fill stitch, the same type of font use, the same type of satins. We can build any shape we need out of the tools we have. And in fact, it makes a lot more sense to do so. So that's one of the ones I wanted to show you guys. I've got several of them. Here's another piece, and this is from a tropical fish place. And yes, I know it's weird, but it's a kind of an aquarium supply place called Hanauma Bay. And this one is actually fairly small. So we'll just go ahead and take a look at this guy, but it's built in much the same way. And here's a really good case for why you might want to build with a fill instead of building the text. Could I have done these in satin? Yes. For this customer, the idea of this wave shape splitting the two colors was super important to them. Super important to them. They wanted to see the waves. And when it was done in satins where I had some of these lines were sharp angles, like straight across each piece, they didn't like it, and they thought that it didn't look smooth enough. And they also didn't like, honestly, they didn't want all the texture of the satins. Every once in a while, you're going to have somebody who says, I want it flat. I want the inside of that flat. So it's one of those things people are looking for. They're trying to see that flat. They're trying to see a flat fill inside of there. So in this particular piece, you can see I actually just used two fills, two different colors to produce those slabs. Are there some cutouts here? Absolutely, there's some cutouts here. Probably could have done without some of them. In Bay there, I think I could have done without those small cuts. Same thing between the M and the A on Hanauma up there. I probably could have done without that. However, what you can see is I was able to build out my fills ahead of time, and then we're doing the same thing again. We're running these pieces, as you can see. We're running the inside pieces. We've got some points out there to make those really sharp lines. And then we're going to run the overall border last. And that's the same kind of building that we talked about previously. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. I've got a couple questions I'm going to go ahead and back up to and see if we can discuss these while we're talking here. First thing, Fanny says, in Wilcom, I use the outline function of doing the node points. It adds a large amount of them, even the straight corner nodes for round shapes. Would that affect the stitch out? Depending on your software, and we can go without being software specific, some software, when you have nodes, it will drop depending on what kind of outline you're doing. It may at the node drop a stitch point if it's straight stitches, and you may not like if there's a bunch of little tiny nodes. Also, I find that if you have a bunch of little nodes, or whatever your software calls the individual stitch points or the individual defined points on a line, that when they're jittery and there's a bunch of tight little nodes in a corner, sometimes you're going to find that those are going to have issues if they're not aligned just perfectly. It seems to me that most software handles any shape better if you're using, if not absolute minimum, you're using less nodes to define the shape and making sure that your curves are nice and shaped nicely. I would say for me, any sort of adding automatic outlines comes with some editing. Here's the thing. A lot of people want an automated tool to absolutely do the work for them. We have a lovely tool that does a magic wand. A lot of people have automated outline addition tools. They do a great deal of work, and most of them have some sort of smoothing put into them. They have a routine to say, okay, we've got too much jitter in this line. Can I smooth it out? However, you should look at automated tools of any kind as the beginning of your process, not the end. If you're going to use that kind of piece, you do it so that you don't have to draw entirely from nothing. Not because you're not going to touch any of the points. If you smash down an automatic outline button or a trace button and then hit any manner of stitch types on that, the chances are you may have some issues with it. It doesn't mean the software is broken, whatever software it is. It means that that shape is not a reasonable shape for embroidery yet. One of the big ones is where you have what I would call an inversion. You'll have a line, you'll have a loop. And I think I can actually, believe I can draw on screen here. So let me see if I can draw on screen and show you this. I am just drawing in a random area. If you have something where you've got a loop here and it forms a loop like this, what you have to realize is in vector, this is the outside. And then suddenly we have an area that transfers over. It makes a loop. If you have a loop in vector like this, suddenly the outside is the inside is the outside of this shape because it's following that outside edge, and now it's defining a hole in the center here. Depending on your software, that can actually cause you issues. Having a loop like that, where you're defining a loop where you're inverting a couple of points, or let's say you have a goofy point in your vector and you pull it out of order so it's down further on the line than it should be, it's going past a point and then backing up on the edge of a shape, you may have issues with the way it generates stitches, or you may have issues with the way it generates underlay, or the underlay may flip to the outside edge, or the inset value may be wrong. It's because you've now told the shape, here's the outside edge, but then inside of this loop is also the inside edge, and the outside edge is pointing in the wrong direction. You have to realize that vectors do have a directionality. They have an inside and an outside. When you close a shape, then there is an inside and an outside always, especially when you're filling a shape. You only want to fill the inside of it. So the way you draw and the way you create your shapes can absolutely change the way things look. It can change the stitch out, especially if we're using tools like, let's say we have a center point defined satin stitch. We don't really get to define our inclination angles on that. It's just going to be defined as, according to how we draw the shape. If we have a goofy shape and it tries to set all of our inclination lines, all of our stitch angles on a roughly drawn shape, and those single line satin borders are pretty bad about this, you may have some issues where the angles of the stitches are funny. And when the angles of the stitches are funny back and forth, you'll see that there's maybe loose density on one side and tight density on the other. And then it goes back the other direction like this because we have multiple stitch angles that are not really jiving with each other. So when you're working on this stuff, you don't have to be picture perfect. You don't have to be a perfect vector artist. You do want to reduce nodes where you can. You don't want to have a lot of weird inset shapes and hook-shaped edges and things that are artifacts of tracing. The artifacts of tracing you should smooth out when you can. The best square you can make is a square that's made with 4 points, if it really is a square, if it really is that kind of shape. And the other thing to remember too, we're talking about things like satin stitches, right? We're talking about satin stitches. No matter how we decide to define a satin stitch, the nature of a satin stitch means that it is a shape with 4 sides. There's no way a satin stitch can be anything but a shape with 4 sides. And hear me out here. If we're looking at a satin stitch, and I mean, we can look at any number of satin stitches here, but let's just go into this art a little deeper and I can just show you what I'm talking about. No matter what shape a satin stitch is, we have this shape here, this little triangular shape kind of. Well, we've got 4 sides no matter what. If I make a loop, if I make it any other method, it's still going to have 4 sides. Why? Well, we have the open ends of the satin stitch here and here. That's 1, 2 points here, 1, 2 points here. And we have the closed, if you want to call it, the outside edges, these edges that are where the stitch penetrations land. Those are 4 sides. If I draw a circle, we still have those. A circular O in any font, whether it's defined with a split line or where you actually break it down yourself, a loop will have 4 sides because you're always going to have a point where it breaks. And at that break, there are the 2 sides of where the satin stitches begin and end, and they meet in that segment, right where that line meets. We're always going to have those 4 sides. And so you need to think of a satin stitch block of any kind as like a ribbon. It's going to have a cut end, it's going to have these open ends, and it's going to have sides. And I think people have issues when they try and create shapes, they try and fill shapes and find that there's angle problems, or they make borders and they have problems with this stuff. They don't think that there's always going to be sides. Also, they don't realize that because we have density, that it would be even if all the stitches are at one angle. If we have a curve or we have something that has a shape that is different on one side than the other, the likelihood it will have is lower density on one side, tighter density on the other side. Inside of a curve will always be tighter density. Outside of a curve will always be lower density, just how it is. So there are things that definitely affect your stitch quality depending on how you draw, depending on how you build your shapes. And invariably, you are going to be dealing with the nature of stitches, whether you want to or not. The natures of stitches are what they are. So we'll go there. Marta says, what does the density map look like on the Namaha? I'll go ahead and show it to you. We'll have to see. I don't know what thread I was using for this, so it may not be as useful. But density map looks like this. We have a couple of places that are a little too deep. I will admit that. But if you look at it right here, the only places where we have a little bit of red are where these satin stitches line up. And honestly, there's not a lot here. Yes, there's red because of the way the rules work for showing you a density map. But yellow density is not something to get too worried about. And even the red density here, some of that is single straight stitch travel stitching. It's not a ton. I would cop to the fact that over here, I probably could work on taking this detail that's in these satin stitches. Let me blow this up a little bigger for you guys. The detail that's in these satin stitches here and here probably has a little bit more overlap than it needs. Old design, I could always go back to it. And because it has a fill underneath it, in fact, these areas are large enough that if I really cared to, I could also cut the fill out. For my money, this is really not too much. A little bit of red like this is not the end of the world. Certainly got a little bit too much here. I probably could have taken this piece and cut it out separately. Because this is a length limit satin stitch that's in this swoosh here, I went ahead and left a lot underneath it because those stitch penetration points tend to show a little color through them. But you'll see that this density is not too crazy. And you know, like I said, I'm willing to risk the fact that some of my stuff is not done perfectly. If you look at the wire line, it probably is actually telling the story a little more truly. Here, the wire line, wherever it's really bright is where there's a, oops, sorry guys. Where it's bright is where there's extra density. I'll say here, I could have worked on my overlaps and my travels a little bit here. Here, because I ran underneath that swoosh and I probably didn't need to for some of that section. And also here, remember I told you guys that there's tighter density and looser density. We can actually show you that. In this satin, my angles are not balanced as well as I'd like them to be here. So let's zoom in as tight as we can. So I know the camera quality is not awesome. Let's go ahead and go back to the map here. On the inside here, if this wasn't overlapped on top of something, you wouldn't see it as much, but on the inside of this corner, this density spike where it's red here is just because I'm on the inside of a corner with a really tight turn. That really tight turn is going to give you a tendency for that. I could have evened out my satin stitch angles a little bit better. And as you can see here, I really probably should have evened that out. These are too close together here and could have backed off a bit. That's why we have a little bright spot here. But if you look at the overall density, balance, not really a problem. Nothing here is horrible. Like I said, on the sports shirts, I had stuff that was even fairly pliable, fairly stretchy, didn't show me any trouble. So once again, proof of the pudding is in the eating. And if you're around me long enough, I'm going to tell you why it's not proof is in the pudding. The proof of the pudding is in the eating. The proof of the design is in the running. And when I ran this design, and I'll go ahead and let's blow it up full width for you for a second. When I ran this design, it didn't show any problems. So I'll say it was a good design. It was successful enough. Looking back on it now, totally have areas where I could have made it lighter, but we ran this on a lot of different garments and I wanted to make sure I wasn't going to have registration problems on different kinds of material. So I went ahead and left it pretty uniform here and didn't work too much into it. But yeah, as you can see, a little bit of red here, definitely more than I probably would have wanted. A little bit here, but a lot of that is in straight stitch travel. This probably could have had a little bit less overlap, but it did also mean that as designs shifted when I was running on stuff like thick sweatshirts, which you can imagine a hockey league will run, some of the times when stuff shifted around a bit, I had some future proofing to using different types of materials. So yeah, I'm willing to show you guys the density map. I'll put my money where my mouth is, and I'll also admit where I could have done stuff better. Because I'll say this, no amount of expertise, and this is an old design, certainly, but no amount of expertise keeps you from making mistakes. No amount of expertise keeps you from having things that you do because you are either lazy or trying to save yourself from some other work that you have to do later. So I will admit, some of my digitizing had to have it out within the day, and that meant that I wasn't going to spend a lot of time cutting out pieces of borders without it run. That's the truth. That's the truth. Production, doing commercial production where I'm doing 15 of those things in a day, in a normal day on top of the rest of my duties. Yeah, 15, 20 designs. I'm probably going to have to cut some corners every once in a while. But yeah, I think it's worthwhile to say. And I'll go ahead and say this. The proof is in your test show. Lisa Shaw, she's correct. Proof is in your test show. The density map is a help, but not the proof. Absolutely. This is something I've talked about many times. The product. What is the product of a digitizer? I know the first thing a lot of people want to say is it's the file, but it's not. The product of the digitizer is the embroidery. Nothing matters about the way the file looks until it's stitched, and it has to live in its own context. It only has a context when it meets the material. Because the material affects the way the stitches run, I can show you the file all day long, but until this thing is on the fabric, you won't know for sure how it's going to run. And if you run it on a tissue tee, really light jersey knit, and then you go run this thing on cotton duck or heavy canvas, you're very likely to have a different experience between the two. So they only live as embroidery. Files look good, and I can judge some things about files. I can see if you took any care about overlaps. I can see if you took care about the way you did your pull compensation, push compensation. I can see if you tried it all. I can't tell you if it's exactly right until I know what it's going on. And even then, it's from a framework built up of years of experience running machines. And here's Brian, creator of the density map, which, by the way, one of the coolest things in any software. That density map is really nice. I always recommend people do what I call a kind of pre-flight check, where you look over your stitch file. And I have absolutely integrated into my pre-flight check before things run a pass through the density map. Anyway, so is what Brian says. Right, the density map helps you identify areas to look at closer, but it's not the authority on your design. And also, I'm going to tell you this. If you did something like I talked about last week, and I'm not super fond of them, but things like three-dimensional satin stitches, which might be a tool in some software, but really it's 3 satin stitches stacked on top of each other, probably look pretty rough in your density map and would run fine if you did it the right way. You have a narrow satin stitch with a wider satin stitch with another wider one on top. As long as you don't mind that you're building up that massive bobbin thread and the massive thread on top, if you want to make that kind of couched, stuffed look of a satin stitch, would look bad on the density map, would run fine on your machine, and might be exactly what you want. The density map provides you information. What that information means to your design and what it means to what you're working on, it's up to you, and it's up to what your results that you want to get. So great explanation. Thank you. Awesome. Happy to have that going on. I know sometimes it means that we don't get to all the topics I might have lined up for a day, but that interaction by far, it's what is great about trade shows that we've all been missing. It was great about a live show like this. And I think it's great in the replay too, even though maybe it's a little different for folks, or maybe you show up for a description and I missed something in a topic. It's why we do part 2s. It's why we keep on rolling, because honestly, I think that kind of interaction is really where it's at. So you guys saw the Hanauma Bay piece. I think that was pretty easy to show. Once again, we're using that negative space here, and I can talk a little bit more about negative space in a minute, but here's another really cool one. This one is very specifically using negative space to its utmost. This one's called sonic leak detection. As you can see, I've got some cool textures here because this had a splash of water behind it, and I did that by just literally executing it one color. Didn't go really complicated, but I did do satin stitches at different angles, showing all these different splashes of water. So once again, the splashes of water in the original piece that was made for a big jacket or a big shirt back print, screen print, all these gradations, all these detail, all these little splashes and droplets and things, and it looked awful. If you tried to translate that into embroidery, it really didn't look very good. But I took the idea of it and said, hey, why don't we use this thread with a nice sheen on it, and I will carve the individual splats of water so you can see it. So I'll show you that. These are just the little, and they actually have a decent amount of underlay in them to give them some sort of texture to make them stand up from the garment as much as they can, more than I would probably usually use if I wasn't trying to get that much dimension. We did that, right? But then here's where it gets fun. We talked about negative space, and I'm actually going to talk more about negative space and what it means in a second. But once again, we have full slab coverage here. Full slab coverage in the background, because the little areas in between the letters are teeny tiny. Cutting those out would be ridiculous. You don't need to do it, particularly when we're going to run satin stitches on top of it. We would just be adding more stitch penetrations all in the same area. But you'll see this thing is entirely defined that way. just like the other piece, but it is absolutely the right way to show it. So here we're defining the inside of the S, those two pieces, the bar between the S and the O, the inside of the O, bar between the O and the N, the bottom inside of the N, between the I and the C, and then the little crossbar from the C, and then a full border on the outside edge. That is all done in negative space. And I actually have an example to show you that everybody has seen. When you talk about negative space and lettering, I feel like it's not hard to discuss, what we're talking about, because everybody has seen this. If you haven't seen one of these sitting on a shelf somewhere, the little Jesus plaque, this one is pretty common. I've seen a lot of other words done like this, but this is the one I see the most. You can see the lettering is defined by what is not there. The objects that we are creating are the spaces between. When I'm talking about negative space, that's what I'm talking about. I mean, we can certainly talk about the artistic quality of negative space. There's no reason why we can't talk about that. I've got a couple links in there to show you. Everyone has seen this. When we're looking at this image, are we looking at, and people talk about this as a thought experiment, are we looking at a vase? Or are we looking at two people staring at each other, right? That's the optical illusion negative space, but it does help us to understand. If you looked on the piece on the right, if I were to make a fill that was that shape with a hole in it of this shape we had there, I could fill in the outside of that. I could fill in the two faces, and I could leave the other area open, or I could use satin stitches around the outside edge and then leave the inside area as a bare fill. And you would still have the urn shape. You are defining the shape by what is not there. And it can mean that we are only stitching the negative areas. So negative space can be used, and bordering negative space often can be used in running borders and running outlines like that. And I find that this is where I'm usually doing it. I'm building up a space that the letter is going to go into. Even if I'm doing a satin stitch letter in that area that is a conventional letter, especially when I'm doing the thing like I showed you before, where I have an outer border and an inner border, usually I'm going to be running the central material, then the outer border, and then the inner border on top. Even when I'm doing that, I'm still kind of employing negative space to do it. And so I've got a couple of other things. Like I said, I showed you this one, which is very much like that sonic leak detection we just showed you. Very similar to ectic. And it's easy to understand when you think about it this way, that we're defining the spaces between things. And this is great for anything we do. I'll show you some more examples of that in a minute. But I will say, we have these art, and let me kill all the ads. But yeah, we have all these art pieces where we can talk about how negative space is used, where we're defining these spaces, and we can see that here white becomes the object, where up here white is the negative space. Well, we can do that in anything we're working on. We can do that in lettering. We can do that in borders. Certainly, you can see people use it artistically. Here's this snowflake, but it's also faces, but it's also Elsa, I believe. I'm not a big Disney guy, but here's the snow princess, and here are the two sisters looking at each other, as well as this being a snowflake, right? We can intimate other things. I mean, the classic ones are things like this. Formula One, FedEx does this. If you look at the FedEx logo, there is a hidden arrow in the negative space that defines something. So we can use it artistically. The one in this Formula One logo is not here. It's defined separately. The thing is, we can also still, let's say we're working on white material and we're having issues with this. We could totally do a red fill, a black fill, and then we could do a white border with a white one and little white details to cut this out. And that would still be an effective way to digitize this piece. You could still use that if you wanted to have big flat areas in the red and the black. You don't have to, let's put it this way. The lettering doesn't have to be the primary stitch type that comes forward. It doesn't have to be on top, nor are you forced to use things in layers that are reasonable. I often talk about layering reasonable to make the dimension look nice. When we're talking about real objects that look like they're in space, that's one thing, right? But when we're dealing with things that are graphical like this, when we're dealing with borders on lettering, when we're dealing with outlining things, when we're dealing with, like I said, any sort of graphical shapes and logo types, we can, when we need to, invert those orders and do things like fill in that block and then detail the border on top of it, especially when we're dealing with things wherein the gaps would be too small to be clean. If we want to sew the gap on top of something instead of trying to cut between two pieces where an open gap would be hard to make it stay clean in a filled area, I can't tell you how many times I have done this, that one piece we just looked at. If we're going to go ahead and look, and I have a ton of stuff loaded up that we'll probably not get to, if we go ahead and look at that Sonic piece again, this is actually fairly small. This is a pretty small piece. It's not hugely small. It's less than 4 inches wide, but it's fairly small. If we look at the way the gaps are done on this, if I shrink it smaller than this, which originally it was done smaller than this, it was originally set to be almost 3 inches wide. If you want to keep those gaps open, sometimes it makes more sense to stitch the gap so I have a solid object that's not going to disappear or shift, rather than leave a hole in between two lines of text. Now, in this particular case, could we make it happen? Of course. You can see the small lettering down here with all this pull comp on it, which makes it look distorted. That is leaving some gaps that are going to stay open, and they're incredibly small. The thing is, when we're dealing with some things, we're trying to define these very specific shapes, it may make more sense for us to stitch the gaps rather than stitching the actual letter. And in this case, it made it look nice. Plus, they wanted this very like techie look. They wanted a flat affect to the lettering itself. They did not want to have cut up different strokes the way that I usually would with any sort of satin stitch lettering. So that's one of those things you can look for. Same thing I said, Hanaumbe, they wanted to have this look like a flat painted surface, and the borders around it having texture were totally fine by them. But this is not, it's not the same for everything, but that negative space does make sense in that case, right? We're going to work to that sort of setup. So, I think that's really what we're looking at. We're talking about negative space. Like I said, we can talk about it artistically here, how we're defining the, we have a gorilla and we have a lion that are defined as the negative spaces in this tree image. That is an artistic use of negative space, but the truth of the matter is we can use that sort of building, this sort of thing that we're seeing here, in creating either borders or in creating lettering itself. Sometimes really small lettering can be defined by outlining it and not by itself, by the objects that you bring to it. So, and like I said, negative space is cool. It's good to look at all these different examples, and that's fine. But like this really does kind of bring it home how we can define space with the filling the infill, not always the object that we're looking at. So it's something worth looking at. I've got that definition there. If you go back to the links list down here, we've got those two articles talking about negative space and how artists use it. And I think it's worth kind of bringing up and discussing, but it's not something we necessarily need to harp on terribly. It's just worth kind of having a moment to talk about it. Because like I said, we're doing borders. Yes, we all think of a border as an object and then we stitch a border around it. That's true. We can, of course, stitch the border under it. We can, of course, outline something with negative space, and the borders can be broken up into several discrete elements that aren't just a border on each object. Part of that is also the kind of desire to start from, let's say, a true type font or a piece of vector art and just take a letter that we're looking at and say, okay, apply a fill to that and then apply a border to that shape. When we do that, we kind of misguide ourselves a little bit in that we don't need to make our finished embroidered piece from the shapes that are present in the art. We just have to have the finished look represent what's in the art out of shapes that make sense for embroidery. So you're going to see things like that infill where we fill little pieces inside behind it, and the use of negative space, and we're building shapes. We're ultimately building shapes. Shape building is the thing we're doing. The reason I'm saying this in a weird way and saying shape building instead of drawing is that sometimes we don't draw a letter, like with the negative space example I already gave you. We build shapes that define the outline of the letter around it, meaning we are building shapes. We're not necessarily drawing a letter. Yes, we will arrive at a letter, but the shapes that we use to get there, the things that we need for embroidery to make sense, the borders, the underlays, the slab fills I showed you, that slab fill shape doesn't exist in the art. It can't. It doesn't exist in the original art. It's not part of the original art necessarily. I mean, you could have drawn it like that with vectors, obviously, but it's not something that necessarily makes sense there. So let's go ahead and pop one of these open and I'll explain it again. It's pretty simple to explain. But let's look at Hanaumbe here. We can look at that, or I mean, better yet, we can go back to the Namaha design. In the Namaha design, as you can see, that slab doesn't really exist in the art. Nowhere in the vector for Namaha is there this slab of text. What there actually is the lettering. The lettering is there, and it has a bunch of outlines. The thing is with print, when you overlap outlines on outlines, or you cut little sections out of them, or you overlap a letter on a letter, as long as the color is continuous when you go to print, when you go to make positives, that color that's continuous will be rendered as one object in the way it prints. It's flat. We don't have that luxury. We are dealing with not only objects, real life thread that's going to layer and have density and all of that. We are also dealing with sequence. What runs first, what runs next, what's on top, what's below. And because of that, we have to process what we're looking at and say, okay, yeah, they might have typed out these letters in a font, but I don't need those shapes. I don't need the shapes of the letters. I need the shape of that big color slab behind it. And that's just something I've got to draw. So that's just what it is. It's not there. We build those shapes ourselves. Let's talk about a couple other pieces. And I'll just show you some other things where we are building the letters out of that negative space. This is one done for Lacumbre Brewing. It looks a little messy because I've got trims and stuff that you can't see. It was small for a small unstructured hat. But as you can see, the way it's built, it has a blend in it. You're going to see that I'm building up my negative space first. This is the outermost border, like I showed before. And this is a rare time when I'm infilling on top of this border. In this hat, I actually used the border to almost seal the hat down, to stitch it down almost like a global underlay. And then I went and infilled. You can see me getting less and less density on each of these because I'm overlapping light density fills to make blends. And I infilled all the letters, centered out. And once those are infilled, you'll see also there's some gaps up here. Why are there gaps? Because there are areas where the outlining and the detail are going to fill in these gaps in the negative space. And you can also see where there are areas that I was not going to reveal any of the outermost red outline, like inside of the R in Le Cumbre. Inside of that R, I didn't put any red. Why? Because it was never going to be revealed after the final outline went down. So these shapes, all the shapes I need, especially the shapes for making all of this gradient action happen, that shape doesn't exist in the art, can't exist in the art. I have to draw it. And honestly, yes, you can look at things like gradient tools. Gradient tools are cool. They don't do blending quite the same way as manual blending. And I wanted to be in control of all of that and not use accordion gradients. And that doesn't mean there aren't places for them, great places for them, not here. Or at least it didn't work that way for me, and I wanted to be more precise. You can hang that on me, but I do like a really good gradient where I'm using multiple colors to arrive at it, and I have nice fields of solid area for each gradient. So drawing that in, you can see now I'm going to fill up that last color. And then we're going to do the final topmost border that is between the two. It's on top of the outer border, on top of the fill. And that's going to define the final shapes. So there's Le Cumbre, and you'll actually see that there's another border. There's an inside outline border, a straight stitch border that I dropped inside of the satin stitch. Now this one is a mess for keeping it all together and keeping it registered. You have to do a lot of futzing around and sequencing things just so to make it work. And even this one looks a little nonsensical. This is one of those ones where the proof of the pudding is in the eating. The proof of the design is in the stitching. It only worked when I did some gymnastics to keep that really unstable hat stitched down. So that's where we went with Le Cumbre. Once again, these shapes don't exist. These shapes have to be created. And you can see the border is defined by this negative space. The letters are defined by a negative space to some degree. And we never just draw a letter. Never in this place have I drawn the inside of this letter first. It's not a letter shape. You won't find one shape that's an M anywhere in here aside from maybe the outline in the straight stitch text. And even then, it doesn't define everything. So it's worth looking at that and kind of think about it that way. We have a couple other things. I did talk earlier about one of the other ways you can do borders, the easy ways to do borders, and that's slab with a contour border. This is one that was done for a company or a place called Magic Forest. It was psychedelia. It had kind of 60s poster art everywhere, black lights, all that stuff. And for this piece, they originally wanted to outline everything, but it looked incredibly messy, especially at the size. This one is actually it's a little under 3 inches wide. It was originally going to be a little smaller. And at this size, the borders just looked like mush. It looked awful because they also had all kinds of gradients inside of borders. Didn't work great for embroidery. It wasn't the right way to go. In this particular case, we just did a slab with an outline. And so I've got a slab here. There's my under my slab. Once again, I'm doing blending. So there's some light densities that are in there. And then I just did a blend on top. And this is one of the places where accordion made sense to me. It didn't have to be perfect. The densities were close enough and it worked all right. A little higher in some areas than I might have liked, but worked okay. And it was going on a darker garment with less contrast, so I didn't have to worry too much if there was some show through. And then we just did a real standard contour on the outside edge. So we blow it up outside of the area of everything here. If you're familiar with Brilliance, it's the same thing that you would do automatically with, say, the knockdown stitch tool, but you can also do it in Stitch Artist 3 using a contour. If you do it in vector art software, you grab your letters and make a contour that expands outside and you make a single object. But in this case, it's a very different thing. This is just a slab fill with a border. But it is, I think, a valid way of considering outlining text. If there's nothing going on inside of the holes and gaps that's worth anything, and all it's doing is causing you pain and suffering, when we're talking about the technical execution, especially on small lettering, it may be worthwhile to talk to somebody who you're working with about doing a contour like this. We're still getting the shape of the overall lettering, and especially this stuff where it has a kind of a wild shape because it is that psychedelia art style. It made more sense to go ahead and do slab and outline. It wasn't what the original art looked like. Sometimes as embroiderers, as digitizers, we make a design that makes sense for embroidery, that evokes the sense of the original art. Could I have fought my way into having little individual outlines on this? Absolutely. It looked like mush. It looked like hamburger. It wasn't all that sensible. And let me just show you a couple more border styles before we go into anything else. U.S. Army border rocker here, rocker patch that I did quite some time ago. But you can see this is another fill style of lettering. But what you're going to see is that sometimes when you have really tiny elements that don't make sense as borders, they don't become borders at all. This is a standard piece of satin stitch here inside of this A. This is not a border. This is not outlined. This is satin stitch. You can see that these angles are offset. These two stitch angles in this fill are this sort of angle and head up. These go the other direction. It was actually, I was reproducing another piece that he had that this guy had as a veteran and a motorcycle rider. And he had a piece that had a similar setup, and I was actually mocking a very similar way that his other piece was done. But we can go ahead and look at this. And what you're going to see is these are done individual letters because this is a really large piece. And once again, we've got that outer border, and then we're doing the inner border. But as you can see at the last second here, I run the inside piece of that A. Why do I run it that way? Because it is so small that it is not going to be able to be made of multiple pieces of border. So you see, once again, I've got my fill down first. I went ahead and run my outer border, and then I cover the gap between the two. These are just meeting, just a little tiny bit of overlap, not a ton, as you can see. But I know that my final border will cover that gap and sit right in that groove. And then, and also you can see this, I didn't just build it out of one piece. Here's essentially one satin. There's a second satin here, another one in the other foot, and then a third. And that defines those areas. And what you can see here, when this pull compensation, when it starts to distort, it opens up little tiny spikes here that are finer than I could have achieved if I had tried to carve these pieces out of satin. And then also, like I said, that central material here, because that could not really work as satin stitch, made a better sense, or as multiple rows of satin stitch, and the green was never going to be showing inside of this gap, I went ahead and just digitized it with one piece. I built the negative space instead. I defined the negative space. The other thing you'll see here is that there are little sharp points on the side of this. Rather than carving this out of satin, could I have done satin for the letter? You could have. These little fine points looked pretty good without it, and it also, the style, having that flat affect, was the style of the original patch. So this piece was done in that same kind of setup. We do have negative space here. I could have left it out. I could have left the fill behind the R, but there was enough gap there, and I was running large enough pieces of satin, I decided to go ahead and bust it out. It didn't make much difference to the travel, at least not enough to make sense of having that much density there. But once again, same kind of attitude. We're running the fill, we're running the background, and then we're doing that border on top of it, right? So once again, just a different style of bordering. I like to show you guys different examples and different styles of bordering so you can kind of get an idea of multiple ways you might want to handle it. And here's one other thing. This is a little tiny bug I did. And yes, this was a mock off of the New Era logo. I originally didn't know this when I first did this piece. It was when they had changed their logo and I wasn't aware of it. But this is a mock-up, kind of a take on the New Era logo for a company called M80. As you can see, it looks a little rough here, but as these things pull open, when these the satin stitches get thinner, it opens up and gets wider. But what you can see here is I'm not drawing any letters. The M and the 8 and the 0 are all there in negative space. And if you look at it, we even have, there are 3 satin stitches that make up the bottom of this M. And I don't turn or fill it all in one piece. I actually have 3 different strokes, 3 pieces of satin, 3 columns making this up. So you can see between the area here, between here, under that part of the M, between the 2 strokes here, go and do the whole border. And then to make it easy, because I had to actually trim all of these, I trimmed them instead of trying to connect to them. So I had clarity. We did the dots there, and I actually left long trims for manual trimming. And in the end, what do we end up with? We end up with something that says M80. And we have that, and it goes on any color and has gaps. But I didn't use a fill, so that I ended up with rough edges, and I was able to define very small gaps in here. Because as we know, satin border is going to be much tighter on the edge than otherwise. Also, you'll see that I didn't do a lot of turning. I didn't do turning stitches around here. I didn't continue an angle because I wanted there to be full density edges all the way around. And as you guys know, as you turn, you have a little tight density on the one side, and then larger density on the outside. In this particular piece, I broke up those edges, and I didn't do a lot of turning around corners aside from in these far corners here. Turned out pretty good. And that's, once again, negative space. It's one way you can define things. I got a couple comments here, so I'm going to go ahead and pop over and see what we have in the comments. Let's see here. Alan Howe says, EC, the embroidery whisperer. You know, it's better than what I usually get. Guru, I don't like very much. I'll say this. I like to talk about embroidery, and I will do so at great length. So glad to have you here and glad that you like it. There's my next topic on the wish list, hand-drawn gradients. You know, we can do that. We can do hand-drawn gradients at some point. It's something where it takes time. It's difficult. It's not difficult. It's time consuming. It is not actually all that difficult. It takes time and planning. If you can do the time and planning, you can select your thread carefully. It is well within everyone's ability in any software. You can do it. And also, I like to teach it in such a way that it's software agnostic. Love the automated tools we have, and automated tools make things easier, but you can do anything you can see in Stitches. And let me clarify this, guys. Anything you can see in Stitches, given enough time, knowledge, and planning, you can do anywhere. You can do with manual stitching. And you'll always have a manual stitching tool or a straight stitching tool. You can make anything you have ever seen in machine embroidery with any software if you want to. Software makes it easier, makes it look great, makes it helpful, gives you tools to gives you like visualization of data, like we saw with the mapping of densities here that is unique to Embrilliance. So there are unique things software does. Like I said, Embrilliance does that awesome stuff, and honestly, it is well worth knowing all these tools. And like I said, I've got favorite tools, and I got talking about knockdown earlier. People love the automated knockdown tool. That's a place where automation is worthwhile, where it doesn't take away your creative aegis. It doesn't take away your ability to make choices. That's an awesome way to use automation and tools, but you should always know how to get what you want out of manual stitches, because if you understand what the individual stitches are doing, you will be able to use tools that throw together stitches automatically, that put together a satin column, that put together a block of fills, that put together a motif stitch, whatever. You can decide that stuff and use those tools more efficiently if you know what the stitches are going to look like in your mind before you get there. And I know that takes experience, that takes difficult runs, it takes looking through a lot of designs, it takes running stuff. Sure, but there also is just a moment. There is a moment where you can just take a second to plan, to look, to get inspiration. You can also just look at embroidery. Look at embroidery. That's all. That's really what it takes to develop the eye. A lot of it is just looking at embroidery and saying, okay, well, how did they make that shape? What are the individual threads doing in concert to make that gradient? There's rows of threads doing this. When we're looking at the border, what pieces are there? If I'm looking at a border and see multiple different blocks of satin stitch going different ways, I should immediately think not, I wonder what their border tool does. I should think, okay, well, they've got multiple blocks of satin stitch. They probably drew those blocks. What blocks would I need to draw in my shape to make that negative space work? And it's hard because, like, okay, Jorita says, how would you know where your negative spaces are going to be when you're drawing? To a degree, you kind of don't. You have to work it out. You look at the design and say, I need to fill these areas. And then you do the same kind of rubric I always do. You talk about stitch types. So I'll go ahead and bring up I can bring up something else. We've talked about this before, and I've actually shown you this piece of one of my presentations before about selecting stitches. I don't have to have it full width. We can just kind of go through it. But let's go ahead and view this in presentation mode so you can actually get a better look at it without looking at all the menus and stuff. We look at the shapes that we have, right? We're saying, all right, I know that I've got these shapes. I need to fill in between the legs of the M. I need to fill in this area. And then we're going to select stitches that make sense for it the way we would with any other shape. We'd say, okay, really tiny lines, really tiny gaps. I might have to go all the way down to straight stitches if I can. I might just have to define it by outlining it with straight stitches because we're less than 8.8 millimeters. We're just teeny tiny, where 2 runs of stitching is going to be 0.4 mils in 40 weight thread. And if it's really, really tiny fine lines, I might have to draw with straight stitches to define something. Very much like I did for the piece that's in the background here. I had to define these things with straight stitches. And those are gaps. And as you can see, I'm really working in the negative here. I'm drawing outside outlines. I'm never filling in the house. I'm filling in all the things that are not house, panel lines. You don't see me digitizing the panels. I'm digitizing the lines between the panels on the wall. That's the kind of thing we're talking about. So when we're looking at this piece, and yes, it's that small. Yes, that's a dime. And here, I'll bring it up. And this is done in 40 weight thread. It is matte finish thread, which runs a little thin. But yes, that's a real picture. These pieces, you can see I'm defining negative space. You don't think about defining negative space, but you are. I'm not stitching the side of the house. I'm stitching the border of the house. I'm stitching a shadow behind it. I'm stitching the panel lines. And the way I know what I'm doing is because I'm looking at the piece and I'm deciding what those shapes are going to be. When we're talking about the borders on lettering, we know what negative space is. Number one, well, because we can look at the shape itself and say, okay, I know I've got an M, which means I've got a couple of like triangular shapes at the top. I've got a couple at the bottom that are going to have to define the gaps between the strokes of the letter. The gaps around the outside are there. When you look at the whole design together and say, okay, the letters are all placed together, I can look at these shapes that are going to be there and I have to figure those out. The rest of it is this. If we've got double borders like I've showed you on these other pieces, and I can actually pop that up, and I think it might be worthwhile to go back to some art here. Let's take a look. We'll go back to something else we've already looked at and discuss it because it's easier that way. Certainly, we can take a look at, we can take a look at how this runs. And sorry, I had a little technical issue there real quickly, but let's go back and take a look at, say, the Namaha piece. When we've got double borders like this, we're going to look at how thick this border is going to be here in the gold, and we're going to understand pull compensation enough to say it's going to get this much thinner. When this runs, it's going to get so much thinner, so I'm going to have a little bit of reveal here. And then I'm going to know, because I know what satin stitches are going to do, I know that they're going to pull narrower. Because I know that, because I know where the final layers are going to be and what's going to be on top, because I have decided on what's going to be on top, what's going to be further in the back. That's the other thing. We have to decide what sequence things are in. In this case, I've decided that the red of the letters is going in the back and that then this border is going before the gold. Now I can see, I can take out all the areas where the gold is going to be completely covering the black. Those don't have to be stitched. That's gone. I can take out anything where it's not going to reveal, and then I can fill in anything where I know it's going to show, and I overlap it into the final border to prevent pull out from, pull distortion, to add enough pull compensation. So what we're taking into account is the sequence of what we're running, the distortion that is present in the design. So pull distortion, push distortion. We're going to look at that. Like, we're going to stop short if the design is going to push. Like I said, open side, we're talking about our satin stitch here, our column. It's going to push up to the top and bottom of that column, this vertical column, and it's going to squeeze into the center. That's what all satin stitches are going to do. We will stop short on the top and bottom ends. We will make it wider than it needs to be on screen, wider than we want it to actually run in the design on screen. So we will do that stuff. And the way we know those negative spaces is by looking at what's going on top of them. If we know that this final piece is going to look like this, right, and we know that there's going to be some gaps in here, well, then I know if I back up that there's going to have to be a piece of satin stitch here where it's going to reveal. So it's about knowing the nature of this embroidery stitch itself. It's about knowing the sequence in which it's going to run. That's really what it is. And then looking at the art holistically. You have to look at the entire piece of art and decide. Same thing here. Like the reason why the blue overlaps quite the way it does is because of where it is in the sequence. I'm going to have some overlap. And also this, you'll see that I actually have a weird kind of fat piece of satin stitch here. Rather than try and carry this fill around in a way that's going to cause a bunch of travel stitches and mess, I know that the border's coming over here and I have something else coming on top of there later. So I just extended this border thicker than it would normally be if I had made it continuous all the way around, because by the time it's finally covered up, you don't see much reveal here. There's a little tiny bit of blue that's there just in case it does reveal, but mostly that's covered up. So what I have there is I have an insurance policy of a little bit of satin stitch just in case it pulls apart. When this white goes down, there's a little tiny bit of blue reveal here. But because I know that everything's going on top of it, I know what I need to have there and what I don't. And I also know about how much I need because I know what pull compensation needs to be there in order for the satin stitch to stay the width that it should. So that's the long and the short of it. And I'll say a couple of things. Lisa said multiple times, what? Not click, poof, done? Never. But that's okay. The first thing to realize when we're doing digitizing of any level above junk, auto process junk, and I'll just say it lightly. I know it's awful. Some automation does work. Some auto digitizing will produce a thing you can stitch. With the right art that is simple enough that doesn't have any problems, that you are not concerned about texture on, you may be able to get something worthwhile. Not great, but worthwhile. If you want to do anything that is more than the flat image that's there, or if your image is complicated whatsoever, you're going to work it more than once. You're also going to draw shapes and then go back and edit the shapes. That's the other thing people get really upset about. They start drawing shapes and thinking like, I've drawn the shape and now it's wrong. Oh, it's so horrible that I have to go back and edit. A lot of trained vector artists, a lot of trained digitizers, they will draw in their corner points or the important points on things and then go back and tweak all the curves every time on every shape. Go look up Von Glitchka. I've talked about him before. He talks about drawing vector art. And the way he handles vector art is to drop points, hard cusp points or line points at every hard corner on a shape. And then he drops a curve point or whatever he needs at high points in every curve, at kind of the apex of every curve or the nadir of every inside curve. And he drops all those points without doing any work on the curvature of the line itself, and then goes back and pulls the handles until the curves are right. And that's how he builds all his vector. And he's an incredibly talented graphic designer, award-winning, definitely can command a price I never could for drawing. Editing is part of life. Editing shapes is part of life. Also making shapes that maybe throwaway shapes so that you can do something else with them, so that you can make something you don't need, or making a shape that is a guideline to help you follow a line. This is part of life for embroidery. If you're going to digitize, you're going to create things, it's worth knowing. If you're not a digitizer, you may never have to do this stuff. What is worth knowing in that case is that if you know how to build shapes or how you would build shapes, it might help you discuss with a digitizer how you would like them to handle the sequence of the pieces of your design, the texture, the way you want stitches used. You can discuss that even if you're not going to do all the drawing and fiddling around with points. But if you are going to draw, worth knowing that. Aaron, migraines suck. Hope you're feeling better. Yeah, no, the ring light is nice and it makes the camera stop flipping out with white balance, but having a migraine, which I have had this morning, I'm a little raw still. If you see me losing track of things a little bit, I do apologize, but I'm going to go grab a cup of coffee and get out of the light for a minute once we're done here today. Fanny says, if I could learn that from you, I will send that Belgian beer physically. And in that, we were talking about the sense of knowing this stuff all together. You know what? You kind of can learn that from me. And you don't need to send me a beer. You can learn that from me in that. If you watch all these various episodes that we've done over the year, if you read my articles, you will get little bits of at least how I learned how to do things. And if you follow the couple of tips that I stress over and over again, number one, that you should watch embroidery run. Watch good designs run on the machine. Watch them like a hawk from beginning to end. Replay designs in your software. Do this thing that you saw me doing. Grab a design that somebody made for you that you love and watch it. Watch the sequence. Measure the stitches. See how much overlap there is. See how it's built. Watch it. Watch it run. Write down the things that are important to you about it. Write down what sticks in your head, what you think that's interesting. Write down the techniques. Measure everything. Measure the fill stitch lengths. Measure the density. Find out what someone has done on a piece that you want to emulate. Heck, take a magnifying glass. Brian, and I have to thank you, Brian, publicly. He gave me an awesome lit jeweler's loop. I have a little jeweler's loop that I carry around everywhere. A jeweler's loop, a little magnifying glass you put right on the surface. And Brian got me a lovely magnified one with lights that I just got recently, and I cannot wait to start using that. And I actually have something I need to give him on this sequence, because I have some tools that I'm going to show you guys later for looking at embroidery closely. Look at embroidery at that level when you really want to figure it out, and look at what the stitches are doing. There are no secrets. There are only things that might be hard to translate, or you might not know where the tools are in your software or exactly how to get them. If you are looking at the stitches, ultimately, they tell the tale, either in the design file itself or in the actual embroidery itself. They tell the tale. If you can identify the stitches, if you can identify what color they are, especially if you can see how they're layered, if you can see how they went down, even on a finished piece, you can at least get some idea of how something is done. You could learn blending by very carefully looking at a blend through loop. And Carolyn says that, yeah, Carolyn, I still have my type loop. Haul that thing out and look at some embroidery. It'll change your life. And actually, it's something I may do with you guys. I may be able to show you some magnified embroidery and talk about it. So I think that's something we'll talk about. Yes, I am a geek. I will do that. There's somebody out there who's going to say it's painful, it's too cerebral, it's thinking too much, it's looking at too much. I will say this, all the good I have been able to do my entire career of designs, and the stuff that is a lot more detailed than this, the stuff that is a lot more detailed than sonic leak detection, the stuff that is a lot even more detailed than this, than the Unser piece. And I was going to show you this as, once again, defining our negative space. And this is a fairly detailed piece that has a lot of little detail in it. But every little good piece I've done, my initial learning, none of it was done in classes. I didn't have a mentor that did this with me. I learned everything I learned about embroidery from watching designs, writing things down, measuring. Not everybody will. And honestly, I'm hoping I save you from having to do the first 6 months or a year of study that I did at late nights, 2 a.m., sitting at a machine trying to figure it out. If I can help you not, bang your head against the wall for the basics, and if I can help you develop a way of looking at things that lets you teach yourself things, that's the best thing I could do here. And I think that's what you're going to do. You can learn this from me, and you can learn this from every embroiderer and every piece you see, which, by the way, is why I am supremely annoying in a clothing store. My poor wife has seen me take a piece of women's clothing that I probably should not be handling and pick it up and flip it inside out and look inside and look at the backing and check it out and bring it up to my eye. I have not yet pulled out the jeweler's loop in public, but there's a time for everything. I have certainly taken a lot of pictures of embroidered clothing that people were wondering that wouldn't even fit on that giant man's leg. But yeah, I have taken an interest in things because studying and looking and observing is going to give you the most return. It really is, because these things they're sitting there in the thread done. They worked. You can tell they worked. The proof is in front of you. So you know that the technique that was used worked. Trying to analyze the technique, really, there's only one stitch in machine embroidery. There is a single point from one drop to the next, from one needle drop to the next needle drop. Everything else is a collection of the direction that stitch is going and how close it is to the next stitch in the line or the next row of stitching. That is all we can control. The machine is limited to that unless we're using special attachments that allow us to do things that are different. Unless we're using multimedia and printing, that can be different. But when we're talking about embroidery itself, we really have that stitch, and we have the way the stitches are collected together, and we have the color and sheen of the thread, and everything is built out of that. And I love this. So as you guys know, Brian writes software and has written in brilliant software, programmed it, and worked on it. And Brian says, I made an entire title, so an entire software title, because of a Pier 1 pillow I noticed shopping with Tanya. Now, I definitely have not, I don't have that ability. I will say I have developed entire types of stitching that I went to use and then pitched to clients based entirely on stuff like that. I will say my wife used to shop at American Eagle, was a favorite of mine for a long time. They did a ton of multimedia and embroidery, and I cribbed so many notes from that stuff. And I also, honestly, I worked with some people who did higher fashion work, and looking at high fashion embroidery, even though it was not practical for what I did, it did give me ideas for texture and blending and thread styles that I brought back into the corporate world. So go to the home world if you're corporate. Go to the corporate world if you're at home. Go to fashion. If you like doing stuff that's super frilly and crazy and nice that way, you do bridal work, go look at streetwear. You love streetwear, go look at bridal veils. Consume widely and then create with focus. Consume widely. Learn every kind of embroidery there is. Look at every kind of fiber art there is. Look at art that you don't even like. Bring back the 2 or 3 things that are interesting from it. That had an interesting color scheme. That had an interesting way of using density. There were long stitches here and short stitches here. They used thick thread and thin thread together. They used this kind of applique on this kind of background. Bring all these things together. Let them just kind of percolate in your mind. Then one day, when you go to create something, you will have all of these sources to work from. And you will have done the other thing, which is to boil it down to the essentials. You will understand some things about density, some things about stitch type, some things about stitch angle that were interesting and managed to produce an effect. And if you consume widely, when it comes time to create, you will have all of these tools. You'll have your palette of colors, stitch types, textures, fabrics in your mind when you create. So consume broadly and create with focus. It's a way to handle that stuff. And yeah, the Pier 1 pillow, absolutely. I have taken a sweatshirt my wife got from, hoodie sweatshirt from, American Eagle or Hollister or any of these mall stores that has one cool thing they did with a letter, and suddenly I will try and make an entire method of handling something, or I will make new materials happen or whatever. And I have pitched that to customers and had people walk away saying, wow, this is such an interesting look. And I'm like, well, what's happening is I'm bringing retail style to your corporate look. And we can do that. And we can do that with everything we do. Like I said, go look at bohemian hand folk embroidery and bring that to a corporate look. Go look at corporate embroidery or really highly figural gestured stuff done for fashion, then bring it to your home project. There's so many cool things that we can learn from each other and from different stylists out there. Donna says, I do that too. Check out how something's made and sewn. My friends don't shop with me because she says I'm embarrassing. Well, you know what? I wouldn't think you're embarrassing. We could go shopping together. So it's fine enough to say, I love looking at things. I love getting inspiration, and you should go out and look. Hand embroidery, weaving, any sort of textile art is the easiest because they are using a similar medium to ours. But upon that, you can go broader, but you can also go fine and say, I'm going to look at different types of machine embroidery. I'm going to look at college mascot embroidery, even though all I do is bridal and floral, and vice versa. All of these things should come together. Because, by the way, floral shading, people have been shading flowers for so long that floral shading is really awesome to look at when you want to put a gradient inside of a corporate logo. Shading is shading is shading, thread is thread is thread. So consume broadly, create with focus. We had a couple of things we were going to cover today. I don't think we're going to cover a lot of it, but here's just a couple things I would like to cover. We talked about shape building a little bit, and here's the thing I want you to understand when we're talking about something that's geometric like this. Last kind of thing to leave you on shape building. It doesn't always work like you would for doing other things, right? It doesn't always work the same way that other types of digitizing work. Whenever I'm making stuff, if I'm working on something specific that is real, you're going to see that I use real structures. You're going to see a couple of things as I'm looking through my samples here. But here's the deal. You guys have seen me show this Habitica patch. It has a griffin. Of course, the griffin isn't real, but when I'm trying to decide on how to break up shapes, break up stitch blocks, I'm going to use elements that are real. In this case, this is a griffin. I'm going to say it has a foot, it has a leg, it has a haunch, it has wings with feathers. And even though it's graphical, I can say there's this kind of beard, there's a beak, there's an eye, there are objects there. So I can say when I'm working on a piece like this, or if I'm working on something more detailed, let's say this is a piece you guys have seen from me before. One of my big crane pieces. This is a giant jacket back. It is a real crane. When I look at it, I'm going to say, okay, well, I'm going to use a satin stitch broken into two pieces for this hook because it is two pieces of cylindrical metal that are attached to each other, and a satin stitch has a nice shadow on one edge and a high spot on it. It works great for cylinders, and it's something I teach when you go look at those articles about dimensional digitizing. You can reuse real structures for that, and that's great because that's what's going to help us when we do photographic stuff, when we do people, when we do animals, when we do cars. We can use real structures to decide how to create shapes. But when we're working on text or borders or geometric stuff, the choices we make are going to be a little more abstract. We're going to have to decide on the texture we want. Do we want carved areas? Do we want satin stitches or fill stitches going different directions so that we get a different sort of light play, even if we're using the same color of thread? Because it definitely, the way you change angles on stitches changes the kind of light that comes back from it when it's reflected. But it's not going to be the same as doing real pieces. So when you're doing shape building, yeah, great. You can do real structures to build shapes, and that's great. Real structures, even if it's not a real thing, can help you. If you have a big flat area that is a panel on a car, a fill stitch is perfect for that. If you have little cylindrical pipes, like exhaust pipes on the stacks on a semi, satin stitch is great for that because it looks like a pipe. It in itself has a texture and a shape that makes sense for real structures. That's great. But when you're working with text, when you're working with fonts, when you're working with these shapes, you have to make shapes that you need that are based on something that's not real, right? And if I'm showing you these pieces, I'm actually going to show you this. This is some art that I did, and this link is in there for working on from Von Glitchka. He did this piece called Draw 21 Days, and you draw something every day for 21 days. And I've got shapes here, and I wanted to show you something about negative space. The thing is, you can make anything out of shapes that are there. You can define shapes differently, and getting your head around that means around these various shapes is to kind of say, all right, I'm going to make sense out of shapes that aren't sensible in and of themselves. And the reason I'm showing you this is actually to show you an exercise I did that I thought was cool, just about getting your head around shape. And let's go ahead and pull this up. We have this piece. This is this reference sheet that he gave us. And he said, just fill in areas in the reference sheet. I didn't do enough. I obviously couldn't get it done. But it was something that I thought was interesting, right? He had all these squiggly lines, and he's saying, okay, define what's in these. And so I'm like, all right, this looks like an axe head. And I decided to do some weird medieval stuff for some reason. I'm like, okay, it looks like armor for a horse, and there's a shield. There's another piece of armor. Here's a guy in a hood, and it's like stained glass. For some reason, this made me think of medieval stained glass. Here's a basket that fits inside of this shape, and a jug. And all of this stuff was predicated upon the shapes that were already there. Well, when we're looking at our shapes for embroidery, there is a similar kind of exercise we go through. Like earlier, we talked about how do you know what the negative shapes are. We look at the overall shape and composition, and we have to decide how we're going to fill these areas. The thing is, it can be arbitrary to some degree. You can fill an area with multiple layers of satin stitch, with a big giant fill stitch, with straight stitches packed together. You can fill an area. You can draw marks with thread in a bunch of ways, and they're not necessarily right or wrong. You can definitely get ideas like I showed you earlier. We can talk about the different widths that make sense for satin stitches. But as you can see, here's all these satin stitches. I'm telling you to go 10 millimeters, and then I show you this thing made out of overlapped satin. This is a jacket back. This area here is gigantic. You would usually put a fill here, but it doesn't give you texture. The rules are not rules. These areas here, those are much longer than the 10 millimeters I'm telling you to look at for satin stitches. So I used a nice split. I used a length limit satin to do it, length limit with an edge pad. But the thing is, you could have used a fill here too, but I wanted the texture. The final look you want to get is something you imagine, and then you define the shapes based on it. Did I ever draw this whole leaf shape? No. Do you draw a whole letter? No. I draw this piece of the stroke, this piece of the stroke, and this piece of the stroke separately in satin stitch blocks, because the satin stitches are always going to be that narrow rectangle, that four-sided object I talked about. And that's the thing. You don't draw those shapes. Did I ever draw an F here? No, I didn't draw an F with flames on it. I drew a tiny section of full density orange, a tiny section of half density, of quarter density orange. I drew a ton of sections of middle orange, a ton of sections of gold. You draw shapes that are not necessarily in the art. You draw the shapes you need. So when you're handling these things, we can give you these rules for what you can fill, but they are not necessarily hard rules. They are not necessarily fast rules that cannot be altered in any other way. And so, like I said, negative space is interesting in this way. I like to say, do some exercises, get out of your head with this stuff. And there's no problem with taking your art that you're using for a logo, printing it out, and drawing on top of it, sketching on top of it, shading on top of it physically if you work better that way. If your learning modality is to get your hands on something with a marker or a piece of, get it on a piece of paper and draw or sketch, do that. If your modality is to get it into digital art software and draw with art software first, so you want the shapes before you get to digitizing, you can do that too. Personally, I do it all in software. I do it all in digitizing software, and I would do things like draw throwaway shapes that I know may not be the shapes I want to try and reason out for myself where I want to break things up. And some of the things to think about, especially if you're dealing with fonts, stuff like this, and I'll pull this out. We don't really need to look at the samples anymore to kind of get on this. What I will look for when I'm breaking down shapes are things like continuous lines. Actually, I will bring one more thing up. I can bring something up in software that is interesting. I'll bring up a personal font that I'm working on, probably soon to be released. It's not one of the ones that I am working on. Other fonts. There are new fonts that are always coming out for Brilliance, and you may see my work there. But this is a font that I'm drawing for myself. So I'm going to go ahead and actually bring this in because I think it's worthwhile just to finish this all up. You look for things like continuous lines. When I'm looking at this shape here, here's this G. We have the G here. There's the solid G. If I look at the original art for this G, right? Let's take my art, and we're going to go ahead and let's hide all the rest of this. We can look at our reference art. I can hide all these pieces here. And here's my reference art, right? My reference art looks like this. I have a continuous line. It's one shape, but we can see when I start to look, okay, well, this little horn, this area is going to have to come off of here. How am I going to decide how to break this up? It's the same thing as we're working with the negative space. It's the same thing as we're working with any art. How do I break this up? How do I make shapes that make sense? And it goes up here in the F too. We'll look at that again in a second. But how am I going to make sense of that? Well, I'm going to have to decide where to break this up. I decided that this little horn is going to be a satin stitch on its own, and it's going to run before this stroke. And one of the ways I make it look nice is to look for a continuous line. And here I've got this curve that's already stroking through here. And if I were drawing this with a big brush or a big fat pen, a big flat nibbed pen, and rotating it as I went, I would draw this stroke and continue on down to here where the stroke ends. Well, I've got this lovely line here. I'm going to look for a curve that encompasses them. And so when we're trying to figure out how to break things up, okay, there we are. I know that I want to run this little horn first, right? I know that that's something I want to have before the rest of it. Well, if that's what I want for that, then what you're going to see is that I've drawn this horn in first as its separate object. The first object is there. That is the little horn. And if I can grab that, you can see that too. Essentially, this first column, there it is. One little column, I've offset my stitch angles so that they don't get pulled apart by the stroke going on top. But then when I draw this column, I'm continuing my curve into the curve that's already there, so it is a smooth transition. A lot of people will do this automatically, and they'll cut between these 2 points, and they'll have one hard line that doesn't match the curve of the letter. This makes it look natural, as if I have drawn this with a brush. And then you can see I've decided to separate my serif. I could have gone all the way up, but then it would mean that I have a limit on my scale of my lettering, because as I scale up, it would get too wide. That satin stitch would get too wide up here. So I decided to make that work that way. And the other thing we can do this as a decorative thing as well. when we're building shapes here, we see this F. Well, I know that I have this little horn that's on the back of the F here. I have this tiny stitch that's not going to hold up. Number one, you can see that I've expanded it. It still maintains the character of the letter, but it is not exact to the art because this is the smallest stitch I want to run on this entire letter. And I need to make sure it's going to stay large enough that when I shrink it down, this is a scalable font, that it's not going to get too small at the smallest size that I allow. Well, you'll see that I now have this gap because I don't want to go through this entire piece. I want to have an open end here that stops. And because I'm trying to miter this corner, I have to decide where to make the cut. Well, in this particular piece, I'm going to look for a line. And this straight line, when I put that in straight, it didn't look elegant. I've got all these lovely swooping curves all up here in the ends of these strokes. So I have created a continuous curve that goes down here. And the thing I'm going to tell you is, at size, yes, have I changed the art somewhat? I have changed the art somewhat. However, I have made something that is continuous, that is congruous with the art. It looks like the style of the art. And that continuous line makes it look good. It just looks good. It looks like it matches. And it makes it look like we have strokes that were made as objects, as if you were drawing with a pen, as if you were creating them in the art originally. So when we're looking to split things up, whether we're talking about our negative spaces, whether we're talking about our borders, whatever we're talking about, whether we're talking about text like this, we look for things that are aesthetically pleasing. We look for lines that make sense. We look for lines that match the style, and we look to break them in a way that is technically good for our embroidery. The little horn that's up here, it's broken apart so that I can have a satin stitch that's going to maintain that width I want at smaller sizes, but won't get too wide for larger sizes and doesn't create a lot of density buildup when we have it smaller. We work toward the technical needs of the embroidery, toward the sense of the art that's in front of us, not exactly to the art, to the sense of the art, because sometimes we have to change things for the medium. And we work toward an aesthetically pleasing look. And that means we're going to make some changes. And when we build shapes, we're going to build them out of things that do all three of those things. We're going to build them out of the right stitch type for the area that makes sense for us. Could I have made these fill letters? You could. The fill letter might have been a little less elegant. I want the shine to change along the turning radius of the satin stitches. This is something I want. And honestly, that's why I'm working toward it with this type of stitch. It could have been fill, especially at different sizes. When I get really, really small, it doesn't make a lot of sense technically. So, all right, with that, guys, I think I'm going to stop there. I've covered a lot of stuff. I wanted to at least touch on all the topics I said I would touch on today, but I think that is probably well enough. And actually, as Justin says, I think Erich is looking to break the time record. No, I'm not. I'm running out of steam. I'm going to be honest with you guys. 3 shows in a day is a little rough. We'll have to see if I continue all that, but it is something that I was already doing that talking earlier, so doing the little show with Erich was cool today. I'll say that. But there is some truth to me going long. Matt, yep, 89 minutes ago. I went for the long one. I think I'm trying to finish off the season strong before I go season 2, year 2 of the Takeup. So Miguel says, satin stitches look better. I think that Phil killed the volume of design. Absolutely. Less shine, less shadow. I'm a satin stitch guy too. I like texture. I like a lot of light, and I use a lot of sheen. Not everybody does. If you're doing something where they want it to look flat using some matte finish thread and a lot of fills, totally valid option. Totally valid option. Not my artistic choice most of the time. And I like this, Ramona, when we're trying to define shapes and you're trying to work out those curves, you can draw. And this is something I very much do as well. Draw with thread. Lime green or fluorescent orange. Yeah, you use a thread color that you're never going to use in the actual finished piece that shows up really well in your art. Use your straight stitch tool and just draw on top of it. Draw lines that you know you're going to throw away. It's what I do when I'm creating. If I'm just trying to find out, like, where do I want the seam between those 2 pieces on that letter, draw with thread and make a line. Absolutely works. That's really great. Jerry just says, like those way those letters are split. Thank you. I'm glad. Frank says, thank you. Great episode. Cindy, thank you. Great class. I'm glad that you think of this as a class. You know, I would like to make this valuable for you guys. Greg says, a great episode of the Takeup. Thanks, Greg. Thank yous all around. You know what? But what I'm going to say, guys, thank you. Thank you for making this possible. Thank you for making it important. Thank you for learning and trying and listening. And thank you for being here with me. So if you have any other ideas for stuff you want to see, you can always comment on these posts. You can comment on my profiles on social media. You can email me at embroideryeric@gmail.com. Check me out at erichcampbell.com. I won't have you probably bother the people at Embrilliance with stuff about the show, but you will find me in the Embrilliance groups as well sometimes. Actually, you'll find me there every day, but I may not always be vocal every day, or at least on every post. But what I would say is come to my stuff directly. Come to the Takeup. Tell me what you want to see in season 2. I've got a lot of ideas here and I have a lot of things I'm going to do, but I would love to fill in with things that you need. So if there are things you need, things you want to see, follow in, comment. If you're watching this after the fact, I'm still happy you're here. Even if you're not doing the live stuff, you can lurk, you can not interact, and that's perfectly fine with me too. But if you have a question you want answered, comment here. You want to see something on the show, comment here, and we will see what we can do for making it happen, because I am here for you guys. So with that, it's been a great Friday. It's been a wonderful first year, and I can't wait to see you for the next year of the Takeup.